She was mocked for adopting a dying horse. At dawn, the animal did something nobody expected. The first light of dawn bled across the pale, frost-covered fields, painting the world in shades of silver and blue. A thick silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional crack of ice as the earth slowly began to wake. In the distance, a small farmhouse stood, hunched against the weight of winter, its wooden walls sagging under the years. The smoke from a single chimney twisted into the sky, mingling with the fog that rolled down from the hills. Clara stood by the window, her eyes distant. The fire crackled softly behind her, the warm glow offering little comfort in the deep cold of the morning. Her hands rested on the sill, pale fingers tracing the lines of frost on the glass. Her heart, much like the world outside, felt heavy, cold and still. It had been months since she left the city, fleeing from the noise and the memories that had clung to her like shadows. She had come here for solitude, for peace, but all she found was the silence that echoed in the corners of the old house and the weight of her own sorrow. Outside, a horse stood at the edge of the barnyard, its coat thin and brittle, its ribs jutting out against the cruel winter winds. It was a horse no one had wanted, a dying creature with no place in the world. Clara had seen the animal for weeks, its every movement slow and labored, as if each breath was a struggle. The townfolk had mocked her when she offered to take it in, calling it foolishness, the last gasp of a lonely woman who could not see the inevitable. But Clara had not cared. She had seen the same emptiness in the horse's eyes that she felt in herself, a quiet sorrow, a shared weight. Her breath fogged up the glass, and she wiped it away with the sleeve of her coat. As she looked out at the creature again, she felt something stir within her, a flicker of hope, a thread that bound her to the dying animal in ways she could not explain. The horse turned its head, locking eyes with her through the window. It was a gaze filled with understanding, silent but profound. In that moment, Clara felt the weight of its gaze, as if it had peeled back the layers of her own heart, exposing something raw and unspoken. The world outside remained still, but Clara knew something had shifted. Clara stepped into the cold morning air, the chill of it biting at her skin, but she did not flinch. Her boots crunched against the frozen earth as she made her way toward the horse, her breath rising in gentle clouds. The wind stirred the snow, sending it drifting across the barnyard, but she paid it no mind. The animal stood unmoving, its dull coat blending into the grey sky. It was a mare, her eyes dark and tired, a silent plea in their depths. Clara approached slowly, her hand outstretched, fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the knowledge of what she was about to do. No one had believed in the horse. No one had believed in Clara either. The townsfolk had watched her take it in, their whispers laced with doubt. They said it was too old, too sick to save. But Clara had seen something different. She saw the way the mare lifted her head to the sky, as if still yearning for the sun to warm her bones. She saw the way the animal's eyes softened when Clara spoke to her, when she laid a hand on her shoulder. "Come, girl," Clara whispered, her voice soft as the wind. "Let me help you." The mare, with a slow and deliberate movement, stepped forward. Clara reached for a bundle of hay and some oats she had prepared. She placed them before the horse and watched as the creature sniffed the food, hesitant at first. The mare's ribs stood out starkly beneath her coat, but she bent her head to eat, her body trembling with each movement. Clara settled beside her, her back against the barn wall. There was a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she pulled it tighter, offering warmth as much to herself as to the mare. The fire she had lit earlier in the house still smouldered, its warmth distant but comforting. The house had been quiet for weeks. The same emptiness that had made her take in this dying animal had lingered within the walls of the cabin, and now it seemed to fill the air between her and the horse. Clara's eyes never left the mare. The simplicity of the gesture, the quiet companionship, filled the space between them. The world beyond the barn seemed to fade. The cold no longer pressed on her skin. The ache in her chest felt just a little lighter. She watched as the horse ate, her ribs expanding and contracting with each slow breath. The faint marks on her coat were visible now, scars of a life lived in pain. There were deeper ones too, hidden beneath the fur, ones that could only be seen if you looked close enough, if you cared enough. Clara had seen those marks in her own reflection, the deep lines etched into her face, the bruises that time had not erased. The townspeople had never known the full story of her. They had only seen the shell she had become after the loss of her husband, the long, empty years that had stretched on like the winter frost that never seemed to melt. But here, now, in this quiet space with the horse, Clara did not feel alone. She had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. The world outside could call her foolish. They could mock her for caring for a dying animal. But inside this barn, there was only her and the mare. Two creatures with hearts worn and frayed, yet still beating, still aching. For a moment, the mare raised her head, her eyes meeting Clara's once more. They shared the silence of it, the bond forged not in grand gestures, but in the quiet understanding that passed between them. Clara did not speak, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. A promise, a silent vow. No one else would help, but she would. And that somehow was enough. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small flask of water. The mare drank it slowly, as if savouring the life it brought, before lowering her head again to the hay. Clara smiled faintly. Her heart lighter, the burden she had carried for so long softened, just for a moment, by this simple act of kindness. And though no one else saw the transformation that was beginning, Clara knew that something had changed. In the quiet of the barn, in the silent communion of breath and shared warmth, they had both been saved. Days passed, and the bond between Clara and the horse deepened. The mare grew stronger, her coat a little less brittle with each passing week. Clara's daily care had become a ritual. The morning feedings, the quiet walks in the barnyard, the warmth she offered when the wind howled outside. In return, the mare's presence, though still fragile, offered Clara something she had not realized she needed. A quiet, grounding companionship that allowed her to breathe again. But something was changing within her too. She found herself walking the same paths she had taken years ago, paths that led to memories she had buried long ago. There were mornings when the mare's soft wicker would stir her from a distant reverie, and Clara would find herself standing before the barn, her gaze lost in the horizon. It was on one of those mornings, when the sun was barely a memory on the horizon, that he appeared. At first, Clara had thought it was the wind, the creak of the barn doors, the distant rustling of leaves. It was only when she heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on snow that she turned. There, standing at the edge of the barnyard, was Jonah. His face was older now, the lines on his brow deeper, his hair graying at the temples. But there was no mistaking him. Jonah had been the man who had once filled her life with promises, the man she had trusted with her love. He was the one who had left her, and now he stood there, watching her with eyes that held nothing but regret. Clara stiffened, her breath shallow. The mare nickered softly, sensing the tension that was suddenly thick in the air. Clara stood still for a moment, gathering the strength to speak. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice rough with the weight of years. Jonah's eyes flickered to the barn behind her, to the mare that stood there quietly, as if nothing had happened. "I heard about the horse," he said softly. "The townsfolk. They said you took in the old mare. Thought I should come and see for myself." Clara felt a knot tighten in her chest. She knew the look in his eyes, one of shame and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit. He hadn't come here for the horse. He had come for something else. "You never cared about horses, Jonah," Clara replied, her voice flat. "So why now?" There was a long silence. Jonah shifted on his feet, his gaze flicking to the ground. He stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't think you'd be here. I didn't think you'd still be waiting." Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she said nothing. The words she wanted to say, the questions, the anger, the hurt, swirled inside her like a storm, but she kept them locked away. She could feel the weight of all the years that had passed, years spent rebuilding the pieces of her life after he had shattered them, years spent alone in the quiet of the farmhouse. "I had to leave," Jonah finally said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't stay. You don't know what it was like. I couldn't save us. I couldn't save myself." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't know? You think I don't understand?" Her words were sharp, like ice. "You left, Jonah. You abandoned me. I had to pick up the pieces while you—" She broke off, her breath catching in her throat. Jonah took a step closer, his voice low, apologetic. "I didn't want to leave you, but I had nothing to give. I was broken. And you You didn't deserve that. You deserve more than a man like me." A bitter laugh escaped Clara's lips, the sound rough and unnatural. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you left because you were protecting me?" Her hands clenched into fists. "You left because it was easier to walk away than face what we were, than face what we lost." Jonah's face twisted in pain, and Clara could see the guilt in his eyes. It was the same guilt she had seen in the townsfolk when they spoke of her, when they whispered about her failed marriage, about the betrayal she had endured. For years, she had tried to bury the truth, about the nights he had come home late, about the promises broken, about the feeling that had gnawed at her heart long before the day he walked away. But now, standing before him, she could feel the weight of those memories pressing against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. The mare stirred, stepping closer to Clara, as if sensing her turmoil. She leaned into the animal's warmth, her fingers brushing the mare's mane. Jonah watched her, his eyes softening. "I never wanted to hurt you, Clara. You have to believe me." Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to the mare, her hand lingering on the horse's back, feeling the steady rhythm of life beneath her fingertips. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You were never the man I thought you were, and I was never the woman I wanted to be with you." The words hung in the air, and Jonah's face fell. He said nothing more. After a long, painful silence, he turned and walked away, his footsteps soft on the snow. Clara stood there, the weight of his absence settling into her bones. She felt something shift within her, a release, a quiet clarity. The past was no longer something she needed to carry. She had let it go, not for him, but for herself. The mare nickered softly, her presence grounding Clara, as if reminding her that this, too, had passed. And with the passing of the storm came the quiet of a new beginning. The days grew shorter as the winter began to tighten its grip on the small town. Clara, once again, found herself walking in the fields beneath the cold, silent sky, with the mare following behind her. She had grown accustomed to the quiet. It was a peaceful silence, but one that now felt full of weight. Something in the world outside had begun to shift, a subtle change, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It was the neighbors who noticed first. They were a quiet, conservative lot, their lives marked by the rhythm of the seasons and the unwritten rules of small-town living. Clara's isolation had never been questioned before, but now, as she walked the streets with the mare by her side, their gazes followed her. Eyes peered from windows, from doorways, from the porches of their homes. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. The silence of the past weeks had begun to feel heavy, as though it too were watching, studying her, as if waiting for her to make the wrong move. It had started with little things. First, there had been the murmurs in the marketplace, whispers just below the surface of every conversation. Then there were the glances, the kind that lingered too long, the kind that spoke of disapproval without a single word being uttered. The town had always prided itself on its traditions, on its unwavering beliefs. But Clara's actions, her decision to keep the dying mare, felt like a crack in the wall, an unexpected shift that made them uneasy. The weather, too, had joined in. The frost came earlier this year. It gripped the fields, wrapping them in a thick blanket of white. It seemed to hang in the air, cold and expectant, as though it, too, was waiting for something. The wind would howl through the trees, bending them low, as if urging the town to make a choice. Clara felt it all, the pressure of eyes upon her, the weight of expectations growing with each passing day. It was subtle, but it was there, and with every new glance, every passing murmur, she felt the walls closing in. But there was one, still, who had not joined the watching world, the mare. She had become Clara's only companion in these days, her soft wickers and gentle nuzzles the only comfort. She no longer seemed as frail, her coat filled out a little, her gait steadier. But even as her strength grew, Clara could sense something else, a deeper awareness in the mare's eyes, an understanding of the weight they both carried. One afternoon, while Clara fed the mare in the barn, there was a knock at the door, a heavy, deliberate knock, the kind that asked to be let in, but did not expect warmth. She opened the door to find a group of townspeople gathered outside. They stood in silence, their faces hard, their posture stiff. They were not there for small talk. They were there for something more. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she did not flinch. She had known this moment was coming. Slowly she stepped aside and let them in, the cold following them like a shadow. "We've been watching," the eldest of the group, Mrs. Wilkins, said. Her voice was tight, her eyes narrowed. "We've heard what you've been doing with that horse." Clara said nothing. She could feel the heat of their gaze, like a weight on her chest. "You've been caring for that creature, even though it's beyond saving," Mrs. Wilkins continued, her tone harsh but laced with a strange undercurrent of something else. "Fear, maybe, or jealousy. We think it's time to let go." Clara met their gaze calmly, her breath slow. "The horse is mine, and I will care for her as I see fit." A murmur of disbelief passed through the group, but Clara stood firm, her hands steady at her sides. She could feel the tension in the room, the weight of their judgment, and it seemed to draw every breath from the air. But she knew, deep down, that the decision wasn't theirs to make. "She's not your problem," Clara said quietly. "She's mine." The group hesitated, their faces softening for a moment, but the silence lingered. It was as if they were waiting for something, a signal, a decision. They had come not to fight, but to witness, to see if Clara would give in to the pressure, to the unspoken rules of the town, to see if she would surrender what she had chosen to protect. For a long while, no one moved. The only sound was the wind outside, pushing against the walls, reminding them of what they could not control. Finally, Mrs. Wilkins spoke again, her voice low. "We will leave you to your choices, Clara. But know this, people are watching, and some choices can't be undone." Without another word, the group turned and left, the door closing behind them with a finality that hung in the air long after they were gone. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She didn't know if they would return, but she knew they had seen her, truly seen her, and that was all that mattered. The choice had been made, not for them, but for herself. The world outside watched, but inside the barn, only the mare remained, her steady presence a reminder that the choice now had always been Clara's. And for once in that stillness, she felt free. The days grew colder, the nights longer. Snow piled up in the corners of the barn, and the wind howled against the walls of Clara's small home. She had grown used to the quiet now, the unspoken tension that lingered in the town. But within the walls of her home, within the space she shared with the mare, there was still a fragile peace, an understanding that seemed to hold the world at bay. It was one evening, after the sun had dipped low and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, that Clara found Jonah standing in her doorway once more. He had come many times in the past few weeks, each time a little more hesitant, a little more broken. She had not invited him in, but tonight something in her shifted. She stepped aside, allowing him to cross the threshold. "I can't stay away," Jonah said softly, his voice rough with regret. "I've been watching you with the mare, and it's made me realize something." Clara didn't respond immediately, but she felt the weight of his words hanging in the air. She busied herself with tending the fire, the crackle of the flames louder than the silence between them. Jonah walked over to the far corner of the room where the mare stood, still and silent as ever. His eyes lingered on the animal for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice breaking, raw with emotion. "I was never the man you needed, Clara," he said, his gaze fixed on the mare. "I thought I could protect you, but I couldn't even protect myself. I was weak, too weak to stand by you when you needed me most." Clara turned to him then, her breath caught in her throat. The words, once unspoken, were now spilling out, and she felt the gravity of them, as if the weight of his confession was pressing down on her too. Jonah's hands trembled at his sides, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing when I left," he continued, his voice growing quieter with each word. "I thought if I could just leave, I could spare you the pain of being with someone like me. But I was wrong. I've spent years running from the truth, running from you, from what we had. And now I realize I've lost everything." The room fell into a heavy silence, and Clara watched him, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. She could see it now, the pain that had always lingered beneath his bravado, the same pain that had driven him to leave, to abandon her. But it wasn't the pain that gripped her now. It was the shame in his eyes, the vulnerability that he had never allowed himself to show. Jonah stepped forward. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry for everything, for all the things I never said, for all the things I should have done." Clara took a deep breath, the words coming slowly, carefully. She did not shout, did not scream, as she might have once done. She simply spoke, her voice steady. "I don't need your apologies, Jonah," she said, her eyes locking with his. "I needed you to stay. I needed you to stand by me. But you didn't, and that's something I had to learn to live with." Jonah looked at her, his expression shattered, as though her words had pierced through him in a way he wasn't prepared for. But Clara did not look away. She was not angry. She wasn't even sad anymore. She was simply present. And then, in a movement that caught them both off guard, Clara walked over to the small wooden table where she kept the mare's blanket, now worn and frayed. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the edges, and turned back to Jonah. "I never needed you to be perfect," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I needed you to be here, and I've been here, alone, waiting, but I'm not waiting anymore." Jonah's eyes widened, his hands trembling as he reached for her, but Clara stepped back, holding the blanket out between them like a gesture of closure. "This is yours," she said quietly, "and so is this." Her hand reached out not for the past but for something new, something they could both start to rebuild, alone or together. Jonah took the blanket from her, his fingers brushing hers, but there was no desperation in his touch now, only understanding. He held it to his chest as if it were the last piece of himself he could give, and in that moment, something passed between them, something that could not be undone, but could perhaps be forgiven. Jonah did not say another word. He simply nodded, a silent promise passing between them. As he left that night, the door closing softly behind him, Clara stood still in the quiet room, the firelight flickering on the walls. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic change, but in the stillness, she felt something shift, something deep and unspoken. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but for the first time, she understood that the future did not need to be carried in silence anymore. The mare nickered softly from the corner, and Clara reached down to stroke her mane, feeling a peace she had not known in years. The bond had been sealed, not by words or grand gestures, but by quiet understanding, and sometimes that was enough. The days had passed quietly since Jonah's departure, and with his absence the barn had begun to feel even quieter. The winds howled outside, but within the walls of her home Clara had found a delicate peace. She spent her days with the mare, tending to her, caring for her, and in turn, the horse had begun to show a new vitality, her coat fuller, her movements stronger, though still marked by fragility. Clara's own heart, once weighed down with the weight of abandonment, had begun to lighten. She had learned to be whole, to be enough, alone. But peace, Clara knew, was never permanent. The world around her, the town, had not forgotten. She could feel it in the way the villagers would glance in her direction when she walked into the market, the subtle judgments that lingered, unspoken but clear. Still, she held her head high. She had made a choice, and the silence she had found in that choice had become her refuge. One evening, as Clara stood near the barn, watching the last light of day sink behind the hills, she heard the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. At first, she thought it was the wind, shifting across the fields, but then the footsteps grew louder. She turned, and there, standing at the edge of the barnyard, was Jonah. Clara's heart skipped, her breath catching in her chest. He looked different. His clothes were ragged, his face drawn with exhaustion, his eyes sunken, as if the weight of the world had fallen upon him in the short time since they last spoke. He was not the same man who had left. He seemed broken, as if life itself had worn him down. "Clara." His voice was barely a whisper, carried on the wind like a fragile thread. Clara said nothing, her gaze steady. She felt no anger now, only an overwhelming sense of resignation. She had moved on, found her own quiet strength. But still, the sight of him, this man who had once been the center of her life, was a reminder of everything she had lost. Jonah took a step forward, his body swaying with fatigue. His eyes were dark, haunted. "I'm sorry," he said, his words heavy with pain. "I wasn't strong enough before. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. But now I see, I was wrong. I see that I've hurt you in ways I can never undo." Clara remained silent, but her heart ached for him. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the vulnerability that had never been there before. This man, this broken man, was not the same one who had walked out on her so many years ago. "I never meant to hurt you," Jonah continued, his voice trembling. "I thought leaving would give you freedom, but all I did was leave you alone to carry everything." Clara took a deep breath, her heart heavy with a truth she had long buried. "And I did carry it, Jonah," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of sorrow. "But it wasn't just your burden to carry. It was mine too." She stepped closer, her eyes meeting his for the first time since his return. "I didn't need you to leave. I needed you to stay, to face things with me. But you ran, and I had to learn to live without you." Jonah's face crumpled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can't change what I did," he whispered, "but I can change what I do now. If you'll let me stay. Let me try to make it right." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She had lived through so many nights alone, thinking of nothing but the life they had lost, the dreams that had slipped through her fingers like sand. She had long stopped expecting him to return. And yet, here he was, broken, seeking something she could not name. "I can't promise you anything," Clara said, her voice small. "But we can try. We can try to find peace together. But not because of what we had, Jonah. Not because of the past, but because of what we can be now." Jonah nodded, his eyes filled with something she had not seen in years. Hope. And that was all he could offer, a hope that perhaps they could rebuild, not from what had been lost, but from what was still there. The wind howled again, but this time it felt different, softer, gentler, as if the storm had passed and left behind only stillness. Jonah stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Clara's shoulder. She did not flinch. She did not push him away. Instead, she simply stood, accepting the quiet presence he offered. The town, the people, had watched in silence. But now, in this moment, Clara understood. Change didn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes, it came with a quiet return, a willingness to face the past, not to bury it, but to live with it, to move forward in spite of it. And as Jonah stood by her side, the mare stepping forward in the fading light, Clara knew that at last they had begun to move forward together, slowly, quietly, but together. Seasons passed with the slow certainty of the earth turning beneath them. The once aching winter gave way to spring, the fields that had been white with snow now blossoming with wildflowers. Clara, her hands calloused from years of hard work, had come to find peace in this new life, one that was no longer defined by absence, but by presence. The mare, once frail and silent, had grown stronger still, her coat full, her steps sure. There was no longer a sense of urgency in Clara's movements. She had learned, finally, how to be at peace with time, to trust it, to allow it to heal what was broken. Jonah had stayed. They had not rushed into the promises of what could be, but instead found quiet comfort in what was. His days were spent alongside Clara, tending to the land, to the animals, to the life they had started to rebuild, together, but in silence. The broken pieces of their past had woven themselves into the fabric of their days, no longer things to be feared, but accepted as part of the whole. They did not speak often of the years they had lost, nor of the pain they had each carried alone. Instead, they spoke with the language of touch, the quiet brush of hands in the morning, the shared warmth beside the fire at night. The townspeople, once skeptical, had grown accustomed to the change. They had not spoken of it, not directly. It was not the sort of thing that could be declared, but quietly acknowledged in the stillness of the everyday. Clara's presence in the market was no longer met with whispers. Now there were nods of understanding, glances that held no judgment, only recognition. Jonah's return had not been dramatic, but it had been accepted, quietly, as if they had always known this was how it would be, though they had never spoken it aloud. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Clara stood by the barn, watching Jonah tend to the mare. The wind stirred the grass, sending ripples across the field. Her heart, once so heavy with the weight of everything lost, now beat with a quiet steadiness, a rhythm that matched the life she had found, a life built not from grand gestures, but from small, quiet moments of understanding. In the cabin, on the mantelpiece, rested a small wooden carving, a gift Jonah had made for her, a likeness of the mare, small and imperfect, but filled with care. It was a symbol of the bond they had forged, not through words, but through presence, through patience. The carving, now worn smooth by time, stood as a reminder of the quiet transformation that had taken place, of the healing that had come not in the form of grand promises, but in the slow, steady unfolding of a life lived together, despite the past. As Clara sat by the fire that night, the sound of the wind outside and the soft crackle of the flames the only sounds in the room, she closed her eyes and thought of all that had changed without anyone ever speaking of it. She thought of the way the world had shifted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the simple act of choosing to stay. And she understood then that sometimes the most profound changes are the ones that are felt, not seen. The world does not always change with great battles, but with quiet steps forward, taken together, where silence is the loudest form of peace.